boy. You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics and public policy because we have as our guest Senator Susan Garrett, who also happens to be chairman of the board of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. And she is across from me and to my direct left, perhaps to my philosophical left, but not necessarily so. We have Sarah Brune, who's the executive director. This is like having a chairman of the board, CEO of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform. And I ask both of you, because I know you're a little bit concerned about spending and money in politics. I think it was Speaker Mike Madigan who said, he says, quoting him, he says, "I manage power and I make money by managing power." Do you folks have a problem with that?
Well, certainly I think there's an issue with the party power structure in Illinois, but this is a national issue, not just in Illinois. Really, campaign finance reform is something that we think could help that a lot.
Could help. In other words, do you think Speaker Mike Madigan has too much power for one person? Because for those who don't know, he is Speaker of the Illinois House. He has been there for, I think, 34 years. He took a 2-year coffee break, as they say, 95, 96, when Lee Michaels was there. Senator Garrett would know this because when she came in and became a state rep in 1998 from the 59th district, right?
Yes.
Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, around there. That was like midway between the speaker's 34-year or so reign. And I'm guessing, Susan, you voted for the speaker, Mike Madigan, to be speaker, right?
Actually, when I was inaugurated, there was a vote of acclamation. The Republicans, there was no vote because Lee Daniels, then the minority leader of the Republicans, gave the votes to the speaker. So we didn't do an official vote.
But you would have supported him. You're a Democrat,
Yeah.
he's a Democrat. I mean, let's cut the...
Right.
You would support him.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying you did anything wrong.
Right.
If you were a Republican in a similar situation, the Republican would be voting for the Republican
Yeah.
speaker.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's that. He's also chairman of the Illinois Democratic Party. He dispenses a lot of funds. Scroll forward, Governor Rauner is now there. He is rebuilding the Illinois party by having a lot of money that he can give out to state rep counties, state senators. People are, sometimes the media are critical of Rauner. I think they should be critical of the speaker. Me, I'm not critical of anybody. This is the way the world is. I take the world the way it is, and we try to modify it to some extent with what you did as a senator, and trying to modify and come up with good legislation. With what you do, Sarah Brune, as executive director, you advocate for good legislation that moves the ball forward in terms of what you view of taking as much money out of politics. Let me ask you, is that what you do? Do you try to take money out of politics?
We would like to like to decrease the amount of money in politics. We would like to lower that amount of money because when you see a state senator or a state representative race exceeding $5 million, that makes running for office seem sort of inaccessible to the average person, and we don't want people to feel disengaged in that way.
So let's get right down to it. I mean, let's stop messing around because we're talking the governor's race of 2018. And the current governor, I don't know, did he spend $60, $70 million, 20 or 30 of his money, 20 or 30 of his rich friends, something like that, in helping him get elected in 2014. And he since and perhaps then also tried to help some state reps and state senators. He would say it's only fair because the Democrats had super majorities. They've lost it in the House, but they had in the Senate. It's only fair that the governor be able to, and he has the means to give some money to these candidates for state Senate and state House to even things up, because I'm sure you folks are both in favor of competition. And then along comes J.B. Pritzker. And I ask you, Senator Garrett, what's the relevance of J.B. Pritzker to this discussion we're having about the 2018 gubernatorial election and what you do day in and day out?
Well, J.B. Pritzker is an equalizer, really, to Rauner. So Rauner has $70 million right now, let's say, in his
fund
campaign account. And J.B. Pritzker is able to self-fund himself and has made a commitment to do that. So, you know,
And
if
why
you're-
is that important
well, it's
to
important
others in the
because
party?
it's important, but it's also troubling. It's important because if you're the Democrats, you don't want the Republican to have an unlimited amount of money to spend without being able to defend yourselves from the
And
Democrat
if you're
point
a
of view.
union and you're giving money as they have to Democrats mostly, and you now see J.B. Pritzker there and he can self-fund, you can take money you might have to give to a gubernatorial candidate and give it instead to state reps and state senate candidates. And it's only fair because Republicans were doing that with Rauner, Democrats are not doing. I used to tell my kids, don't use that word fair because it has no meaning. But now I've learned from Senator Garrett and from Sarah Brune, Executive Director of Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, there is meaning to fairness.
Well, it's
Is
strategic.
that, let me just ask
It's-
Sarah because I
It's
want to get
not
her
fair
involved in this.
necessarily, but I do want
It's
to
not
say
fair?
this. It's not really fair. It's strategic. So from the party point of view, it makes total sense to find candidates who can self-fund because on both sides, that's what's happening. These candidates who are self-funding, the money that would come to them is now going to go down to the lower races. So that is
good?
strategic.
Is that good? Because
it's-
people, we want to know about state reps, we want to know about state senators. Look, when we buy shampoo, we have to know about that to make the right decision. When we buy a car, we have to know about that. When we buy anything. So we're not buying, but we're sort of selecting candidates. Shouldn't we have a lot of information? Money provides information, advertising provides information.
So it's
Really, do you want to just go home? Because is there anything left for the Illinois
So
campaign
it's
to do?
strategic. It's strategic for both parties to do that.
Okay.
I think we can agree on that. But is it fair to others who are also thinking of running for office? Maybe somebody else would like to run for governor, maybe a woman, and that woman is saying, okay, here I am. I don't have access to $70 million. I can't
Well, there's some
self-fund.
women who
So
do have
how can
access. I mean-
how can I put myself in this type of a race? So it excludes people who might even be more talented from running for office, and that's what makes it troubling.
I would also
Well-
disagree with your point that more money equals more educational information for voters. I think if we see $5 million worth of ads in a legislative district, those ads are not necessarily substantive. And in 2016, we saw very few substantive ads, especially towards the end. They only offered a competing political narrative to almost confuse voters and really make them feel disengaged from the process because they don't see a substantive discussion on the issues.
They're negative ads.
Well,
That's how
where's my constitution? I have
people
two
can
constitutions,
win.
and what did I do with it? I have the Constitution before, but anyway, we don't need to get the Constitution out. It's somewhere around here. But we have the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom, free speech. The courts have sort of said money is speech. That's a Supreme Court decision. Citizens United, I'm sure you both favor Citizens United. I'm just being facetious. You may not, but it is the law of the land. And, you know, deciding what is useful to a voter and not, it's not really for us to decide. This is a relationship between the candidates and their voters. Just like when you buy a Lexus or you buy an Audi, the relationship is between Lexus and Audi and all of those car manufacturers and their consumers.
those
I mean,
are
isn't it
vehicles.
similar?
This is public policy. These campaigns, these elections affect people's lives. And so I would hate to compare a campaign to a vehicle, an automobile. When the stakes couldn't be higher in Illinois right now, and you've got candidates who can just bankroll themselves, and there might be others out there who have better ideas, who might be able to actually make some changes that will be have a positive impact on people's lives. So instead, we are only talking about the money.
Well, hold on.
That's what we're talking
Let
about.
me bring some of the other candidates into the discussion. Chris Kennedy is a candidate. He has a fair amount of money, not as much as J.B. Pritzker, I don't believe, but a fair amount. He has a family name. His His uncle was JFK. Remember John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. His father was Robert F. Kennedy, who was assassinated running for the Democratic nomination to president in 1968, I believe. And he has that Camelot. He has that cachet. It's not unimportant, and I don't say it. I know, I met Chris a little bit. I met JB. These are people of substance. They have advantages, but they feel, I think it would be fair to say for both those individuals, as it is for Governor Rauner, to those who have received much, by hard work or otherwise, much is expected. So we're rounding out the field here now. We got J.B. Pritzker. We can talk substance if you like about him. I know it's not your goal of the organization, but we are talking substance. We have Chris Kennedy. We have Daniel Biss. He's not a person of enormous wealth, not much wealth at all. He's a person of, he's State Senator Daniel Biss, Democrat, probably 8 to 10 years in the state legislature, right? I mean, there's choices is what I'm saying. You got Kennedy, you got Biss, you got J.B. Pritzker, you got Amaya Pawar, 36-year-old alderman, the first Indian American, I believe, alderman, and you got 3 or 4 other candidates. I think it would be reasonable to say you've got a lot of choice. I'm a little surprised the Democrats don't have a female in the race, and there should be one. I would say that. But you putting that aside just for a second, your turn. Are you seeing a lot of choice in terms of wealth, in terms of how they got there, in terms of background between those 4 Democratic candidates?
I think there's some choice there, but I think to the average person, they don't feel like that office is accessible to them anymore. I mean, they see candidates raising, $50 million before the race even starts. They see, Senator Biss probably running almost the most traditional mix of a fundraising campaign as we've seen, but Pritzker has not really taken outside contributions. They all have a different fundraising strategy, but money is the topic of the conversation. Money continues to be the main thing that we talk about for all of these candidates, and it sort of takes up all the air in the room. It doesn't allow us to discuss a lot of the other important issues.
Do you
And-
agree,
we
do you
need to.
agree with
Yeah,
your
I
colleagues,
totally
Senator?
agree, and I think that Illinois is now being talked about regarding this gubernatorial election in 2018 as the most expensive in the country.
In the country.
Not even close. The last
Well, we're a
election
leader
that
in
was
something.
close
I mean,
was
that counts.
Meg
We're a
Whitman
leader.
and Jerry Brown
In California.
in California. And Meg Whitman put in $220 million of her own money.
Doesn't
And
that-
we're going to exceed that in this particular
Doesn't that refute
gubernatorial
your thing
race.
about women? Here was a woman, Meg Whitman, she had 220 million. She could compete with the boys.
Right.
So
She-
it's not necessarily a gender thing. I don't know why.
No,
we
we're not
should have-
focused on
Oh,
that.
but I know, but
We
you
want
mentioned that,
general
yeah.
diversity in the candidate
Okay.
pool.
Yeah.
By making
Okay.
sure elections are accessible to everyone, you're going to increase diversity
So
in
what do
your
you do
candidate
here
pool.
at the Illinois campaign? What do you do to have an impact to somehow, well, what do you do to have an impact on the point issues we've just been discussing?
Well, we advocate legislation we think is important, but that's just one thing that we do. We also hold events so that people can discuss this topic. We bring in experts from other states. We brought in an advocate from California who talked about what they've done there.
We're going to bid farewell to Senator Garrett,
And we have the small donor democracy.
Yes, we
program,
do.
too.
and she has a prior engagement. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming.
you. I
We will
enjoyed
have
it.
you back.
We will continue this conversation.
All right, thank you, Susan.
So beyond advocating important legislative changes, a small donor matching system being one of them, which we can discuss, we also hold events to get people's questions answered about this and educate people on this issue. But we also provide factual, nonpartisan information on these issues because I think voters need to understand that money in politics is one of the root issues that lead to a lot of other problems they have with democracy today.
What are those other problems?
Well, I think that when they see the cost of elections rising, that concerns them. They feel a lack of involvement. They don't feel engaged in their government. And I think that money in politics is contributing to that. I also think that the significant amount of money in politics in Illinois is leading to some of the partisan gridlock that we have here. Because when all of the money is sort of concentrated at the top of the party, or when, running for office, even local office, costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, you have to rely on your party leadership to help you fundraise, to help you, really run those ads. And that creates a certain power structure that I think can be damaging and that can discourage independence.
Yes, but on the other hand, people, if you were to ask people, and you're in touch with folks, people
Sure.
call into the Illinois campaign, they tell you what's on their mind, you read online, you're pretty aware.
Sure.
What's the biggest issue in the state of Illinois in the last 2 years?
The budget.
The budget. The state budget impasse. And set the scene for us. Just step out. I know that's not your main focus, but you're aware of this. Inform
Sure.
what have the people been, why has that been a big issue?
People were absolutely flabbergasted that we did not have a budget for 2 years, and the average person did not understand how that could possibly occur. They couldn't wrap their mind around the fact that rank and file legislators were not able to move that process along. And part of my job was to explain to them, rank and file legislators did not have a lot of power in that situation. It was up to the leadership to kind of negotiate a deal there, and the rank and file would have to take certain votes because of the party that they're in. Now, you look at the solution that actually was passed, you saw some Republicans vote for the veto override, and those Republicans are likely now to face retribution, whether in their primary or in their election, or not receive money from their party.
But isn't that, if it had been reversed, and if a bunch of Democrats had gone against Speaker Madigan,
Oh,
there
this
would
is
be
not,
retribution.
right.
It's not partisan.
This is not a
right?
single partisan issue. No, both sides of the
It's
aisle are
called
absolutely.
party discipline. And
Well,
we have
it can reach a
two-party-
point where it's too extreme and it creates
Is it? Is it?
ongoing gridlock.
Because Dan Proft, you know that name. He's on WIND radio. He ran for governor in 2010. He describes the 15 Republicans who voted to support the tax increase, and then when there was an override, the governor vetoed that tax increase, and then the Democrats overrode that. They got 10 Republicans to join with now. The Democrats had to get a few more of their group because they only had 10 Republicans to help them. But Proft looked at it and he says, this is how a minority party stays a minority party, because if in large part many voters didn't want a tax increase, if Democrats had to vote for that, as Speaker Madigan was pushing them, they would lose, and you'd have a more competitive system. Instead, the Speaker was able to persuade the Republicans. Steve Anderson became, in a sense, Mike Madigan's whip. He was getting other Republicans to vote for this tax increase. So are you more sympathetic with Dan Proft's point that this is not good for democracy? Everybody says, oh, that's bipartisan, but the end result is you're more likely to have a supermajority, or at least a large majority of Democrats in the House and the Senate. Speaker Madigan continues his reign. Are you somewhat sympathetic to what Proft is saying there?
Well, I think that legislators should be able to vote their district, and they should be accountable to their constituents and not to any one person or any one leader. And when running for office costs millions of dollars and they know that they can't raise that money themselves because, they don't have access to those kind of funds,
But it said
they have
that-
to rely on the party.
But it said that in those districts, those 10 Republicans who voted to override the governor's veto, it wasn't the voters those folks were talking about. They were getting pressure from prisons and people who ran those prisons and worked at those prisons in the area, people who worked at the state university system, the teachers' unions, the other unions. In other words, we usually call those vested interests. They were being propelled to vote for this tax increase, from what I can tell, not by a judicious, wise decision of what was best for society. They said, what's the best thing I can do to get reelected? So they put aside the voters because they thought if they could get more money from these vested interests, that would help them get reelected. Do you acknowledge that that's a possibility, and how do you square that with what you just said?
Well, certainly special interests have been a long-standing issue in money in politics, and that's really what we used to talk about exclusively was special interests. And a special interest can be any type of person who has a particular interest in one thing and has money to give your reelection campaign or has money to contribute to efforts towards you being reelected and makes it difficult for you to vote against them even if it's not in the overall common good.
So do you want to limit those special interests, the unions and how much they can contribute, the state employee unions, the public sector unions?
Well, they are limited by the contribution limits that we have. Now, there are issues with those.
Effective?
I think that those contribution limits are, I'm glad that they're there. In a sense, I don't wish that they didn't exist. But there are issues. One of the issues being a mechanism that allows those limits to be lifted if a super PAC gets involved in a race over $100,000, which these days is a very small amount, or if a candidate self-funds in excess of $250,000, which is, again, not much in many of these races. So
the limits get lifted then.
Mm-hmm.
Is that good or bad?
No other state in the nation has this provision. I don't think that it's something that benefits those individual residents in that district, because you'll get $5 million spent on a legislative district that might be, 50 or 60,000 people. And you have to wonder, at what point do you have some diminishing returns where people are seeing constant political ads back to back to back from both parties, and the competing narratives are just too much to digest. And I think it's really overwhelming for a lot of voters. That's what we hear.
Do you think, Geek, is some of the enormous spending, some say, that exists in the political arena these days is because there's been historically over the last century or so, since the 1930s, it's almost a century, government power has increased. And it's become more and more on the federal level, but also on the state level and the county level. So if you have more things being decided by government, the prize for controlling government is greater, more will be spent. And I understand, and I think you're totally sincere, and as is Susan, in what you're doing here, and the folks who work with you, which by the way include interns, and people can find out more about the Illinois campaign by going to Illinois ilcampaign.org. Did I get that right?
Yes.
ilcampaign.org. You always have opportunities for people to come and work side by side with you and Susan. We would call them interns, we would call them part-time employees,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Absolutely.
So, and they don't have to be Democrats or Republicans. In fact, you would not ask people that.
No, we wouldn't ask
You're not a
their
partisan
part.
organization.
We're nonpartisan.
You're nonpartisan.
That's correct.
And
But we work with people on both sides
on
of the
both
aisle.
sides. Okay, but do you see that point, that argument that by shifting more power to government, you're going to have more expenditures, and if you push, as you have, for limitations on campaign contributions and so forth, if you have those limitations, it's like pushing on a balloon. It goes down in one area, it pops up in the other. Remember, there are PACs, there are political action committees, there are all sorts of organizations. When the legislation limits in one area, people are very creative, and the legislator and the lawyers are very creative, and they will find ways
Absolutely.
to circumvent this.
I think
So what
that's
do you
a
say
very-
to these people that you really cannot take the money out of politics because push down one area, it just pops up in the other?
I think that's a thoughtful point, and
Pardon, that's what?
it's a very thoughtful point. And it's something that we definitely struggle with. I'm not willing to say it's too hard, we're going to quit. I think that this is something that we have to deal with. ICPR was instrumental in passing the campaign finance limits that we have today in Illinois. That doesn't mean that there aren't things we still need to change. You pass legislation, you see how the world changes and how the dynamics in campaigns change, and you have to change your policy to reflect those new things. And it sometimes feels like a game of whack-a-mole, but it's something that we have to continue to do. There are certain realities in place, and Citizens United, and other federal laws create those realities. We have to work within those. That's why we propose something like a small donor matching system, which would incentivize local grassroots donors to be giving to their local candidates, so that those small contributions can be matched by a small amount of public funds, and essentially many contributions from all types of people become equal. So you don't have one person who's funding you at $20 million and one person at $75. there are strict contribution limits in this opt-in system so that everyone can only give about $500 and it levels the playing field.
But it tends, you know, we have public financing of presidential elections, right? You can opt in or opt out.
Right.
And Barack Obama in 2008 did what? Do you know about that?
I know a little bit about that.
He opted out, didn't he? He decided it was not in his interest and the party's interest to abide by those limitations to accept that public funding, right?
Well, and you
So
have
he,
to.
McCain did, actually the Republican did, McCain of McCain Finance, but the great liberal, the great public, and I say this not so, people know that Barack Obama sat here and did 6 shows. And I always tell if guests are reluctant, like Sarah, if Sarah was reluctant to appear, I just say, well, Barack did, and he became president. So Sarah's on her way to become the president of the United States, right? But seriously,
I'm here.
could you defend Barack in that decision? Because he just decided it was better for him to opt out of this.
Well, I think it's important to incentivize the program in a way that makes people want to take part. And that's why we have an advantage here at the state level. We've seen what has worked and what has not worked. We have other models in other cities. We have other models at the national level.
We don't have, but yours is a proposal, but we don't have that small donor matching system in Illinois.
We don't.
Yet.
We do not.
But you would like to have
We
it.
would like to have that.
But, you know, some people would say, well, if you do that, you take my money, Jim Smith's money, other people who have no interest in funding Daniel Biss or
Right.
Governor Rauner if he were to participate, and you force them to do it. Is that any way to run a railroad? Is that a free country when I force somebody to give money to somebody whose politics are different from mine?
I totally understand that argument, but I think it's important to think of this kind of a system as an election administration system. We pay in order to ensure that our elections are run fairly, ensure that our elections are accessible to everyone, ensure that there is no voter suppression, ensure to make sure that voting is available to everyone, and part of that is making sure that we have a diverse set of candidates, making sure that all types of people can run for office. This system would contribute to that goal. So I think of
So
it.
you're comfortable, you understand the loss of freedom, liberty for some people, but you're saying the public good in this case requires that.
I understand the argument, but I think this is the most significant policy that we have out there that can make a difference in our campaign finance, and for that reason I think it's worthy of funding.
So if you look at the long sweep of history, you've heard of Watergate.
Sure.
You know, post-Watergate, we had campaign finance reform. That was 1974. We're almost a half century since. Is the country better with campaign finance limitations than it was in 1974?
Well, I think that's complicated because things
I know
have
we
been.
only have a minute, so you gotta give a short answer.
I think that if we commit to limits in a way that everyone has to abide by them, they can be successful. Right now, loopholes still exist in many ways that people can take advantage of, and as long as those loopholes exist, they will continue to do so.
So your job at the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, that's ilcampaign.org. You, Sarah Brune, Executive Director, Susan Garrett, Chairman of the Board, our guest today, as we tape this show on August 8th, 2017. Your job is to try to limit those loopholes, try to make the laws that limit campaign contributions effective, and broaden it by having things like matching funds, public funds for small donors, right?
That's one of the most important things we do, in my opinion.
And is this the most important thing that you can do to affect democracy? What you're doing day in and day out?
I believe that campaign finance reform is absolutely essential.
All right. Just remember, folks, remember Sarah Brune, remember Susan Garrett, Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, ilcampaign.org, and you come back next week and every week to Public Affairs.